The cold steel of the auction block chilled Cassandra Shaw's bare feet as she clutched her infant daughter against her chest, trying desperately to shield the child from the leering eyes of the crowd gathered in Black Hawk, Colorado. The year was 1867, and this former schoolteacher from Boston had never imagined she would end up here, a widowed mother being sold to the highest bidder while her 3-month-old baby whimpered against her breast. "Next up, a fine young woman and her babe," called the auctioneer, his voice carrying across the dusty town square. "Strong back, educated tongue, and still producing milk for the infant. Start your bidding at $50, Cassandra trembled, both from the spring mountain chill and from terror. Her late husband's debts had left her destitute, and his unscrupulous business partner had arranged this indentured servitude auction, a barely disguised form of slavery that persisted in these remote territories, despite the recent war that had supposedly ended such practices. The crowd murmured as bids began to rise. $50, $65, $80 from a red-faced saloon owner whose reputation made Cassandra's blood run cold. $100 from a silver mine operator looking for both a wet nurse and a woman to warm his bed. She closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face as she pressed a gentle kiss to her daughter's downy head. "I'm sorry, Emily," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." $200, came a deep voice from the back of the crowd. The gathering parted as a tall figure stepped forward. Cassandra's eyes fell upon a broad-shouldered man with sun-weathered skin and piercing blue eyes beneath the brim of a worn Stetson. A leather gun belt hung low on his hips, and dust covered his denim pants and boots, suggesting he'd ridden far and fast. "Mr. Blake O'Connor," the auctioneer acknowledged with surprise. $200 for the woman and child. The cowboy nodded once, his expression unreadable as he approached the auction block. His eyes met Cassandra's briefly, and she thought she detected a flicker of compassion amid his otherwise stoic demeanor. "Anyone to challenge Mr. O'Connor's bid?" the auctioneer called. The saloon owner spat into the dirt. $220. $300, Blake countered immediately, his voice betraying no emotion. A tense silence fell over the crowd. The mine operator and saloon owner exchanged glances, calculating whether the woman and infant were worth such a sum. $300 going once, going twice. The auctioneer's gavel hovered in the air. Sold to Blake O'Connor for $300. Cassandra's legs nearly gave out beneath her. She didn't know this man, whether his intentions were noble or vile, but at least she and Emily had avoided the clutches of the saloon owner, whose treatment of women was notoriously brutal. Blake paid the auctioneer, then approached Cassandra. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, suggesting he was in his early 30s. His face was handsome in a rugged way, with a strong jaw partially covered by several days' worth of stubble. "Come with me," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Clutching Emily tighter, Cassandra stepped down from the auction block and followed him through the dispersing crowd. She felt the stares burning into her back, some curious, others disapproving, a few envious of Blake's purchase. He led her to a sturdy chestnut gelding tied to a hitching post outside the general store. From his saddlebag, he withdrew a worn but clean blanket, which he handed to her. "For the little one," he said, watching as she carefully wrapped the blanket around Emily. Then he removed his duster coat and placed it around Cassandra's shoulders. The unexpected kindness nearly undid her. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Blake's eyes flicked toward the crowd, some of whom were still watching them. "Not here," he replied. "My ranch is a few hours' ride. Can you manage that with the baby?" Cassandra nodded, though in truth she wasn't sure. She had never ridden astride, let alone with an infant. Blake seemed to read her uncertainty. I'll hold her while you mount, then hand her back to you. We'll take it slow." True to his word, he carefully took Emily, supporting her tiny head with practiced ease that surprised Cassandra. After helping Cassandra onto the horse, he returned the baby to her arms, then mounted behind her, his chest warm against her back as he reached around to take the reins. "I won't let anything happen to either of you," he said quietly, and then, louder for the benefit of onlookers, "Let's get home, Mrs. O'Connor." The false name startled her, but she understood its purpose. If people believed she was his wife, they would be less likely to question his actions. As they rode out of town, Cassandra found her voice. "My name is Cassandra Shaw. This is my daughter, Emily." "Blake O'Connor," he replied. "And I meant what I said. I'll protect you both." "You don't even know me," she said, unable to hide her suspicion. Men didn't spend $300 out of pure kindness, especially not in a place like this. "I know enough," he said simply. Then, after a pause, "My sister was widowed young with a baby. No one helped her. I couldn't stand by and watch it happen again." They rode in silence for some time, following a trail that led away from Black Hawk and into the rolling foothills. Emily slept peacefully, lulled by the steady rhythm of the horse's gait. As they climbed higher, Cassandra could see the vast expanse of Colorado territory spread out before them, beautiful, wild, and utterly foreign to her eastern sensibilities. "What happened to your sister?" she finally asked. Blake's body tensed slightly behind her. "Typhoid took them, both her and my nephew, 3 years ago." "I'm sorry," Cassandra said softly. "It was after the war," he continued, his voice distant. "I was still back east serving with the Union cavalry. By the time I received word and made it home to Illinois, they were already gone." He paused. "That's when I headed west. Nothing left for me there." Cassandra absorbed this information, trying to reconcile it with the man whose arms encircled her protectively as they rode. A former Union soldier, now turned rancher, it was a common enough story in these post-war years, men seeking new beginnings in the untamed West. "Emily's father?" Blake asked after another long stretch of silence. "Thomas died of influenza this past winter," Cassandra replied, the grief still raw. "We'd only been married a year. He was a schoolteacher like me, but he had dreams of the West, convinced me to leave Boston and come to Colorado." She swallowed hard. "He had borrowed money to start a store in Black Hawk. When he died, his business partner claimed I owed the debt. He took everything, our home, Thomas's inventory, even my wedding ring, and still said it wasn't enough." "And so he sold you," Blake said, his voice hardening. "Mr. Hollister said it was legal, indentured servitude to pay the remaining debt." She laughed bitterly. 7 years of service, he claimed. Emily was an added bonus for whoever purchased me. Blake's jaw tightened. "Hollister is wrong. The 13th Amendment outlawed such practices 2 years ago, even in the territories. What he did was illegal." "It wouldn't be the first law ignored out here," Cassandra replied. "No," Blake agreed grimly. "But that doesn't make it right." As the afternoon wore on, they climbed higher into the foothills. Emily woke and began to fuss, hungry after the long ride. "There's a creek just ahead," Blake said. "We'll stop so you can tend to her." The spot he chose was sheltered by pines, with a clear stream bubbling over rocks. He dismounted first, then helped Cassandra down, his strong hands gentle at her waist. The contact was brief, but stirred something unexpected within her, a feeling she immediately tried to suppress. While Cassandra sat on a fallen log to nurse Emily, Blake unsaddled the horse to let it rest and drink. He kept his back to her, providing privacy, and busied himself with gathering kindling for a small fire. "How much further?" she asked, adjusting her dress when Emily had finished feeding. "About an hour," Blake replied, striking a match to light the fire. "We'll warm up a bit first." The nights get cold up here, even in spring." He produced a small pot and some coffee from his saddlebag, setting water to boil over the fire. From a cloth bundle, he offered her jerky and hardtack, simple trail food, but Cassandra accepted it gratefully, having eaten nothing since dawn. "Your ranch," she began hesitantly as they shared the makeshift meal. "What should I expect there?" Blake poured her a cup of the strong black coffee. "It's modest compared to some. 160 acres under the Homestead Act, been working it for about 2 years now. I raise cattle primarily, have about 40 head. The cabin's small but solid, 2 rooms with a root cellar beneath. There's a good well and a garden plot that could use a woman's touch." He paused, seeming to realize how that sounded. "Not that you're obligated to work it." "I just meant, I understand," Cassandra assured him, surprised by his awkwardness. "And I'm willing to work. I've never gardened much, but I can learn. The nearest neighbor is the Wilsons, about 3 miles east. Good people. Mrs. Wilson might be happy to have another woman nearby." Blake stared into his coffee cup. "As for your situation, once we arrive, you're free to make your own decisions. I'll help you get established somewhere else if that's what you want." The offer stunned Cassandra. "You'd spend $300 just to let me go?" Blake's blue eyes met hers. "I didn't buy you, Mrs. Shaw. I paid to get you and your daughter away from men who would have hurt you both. What you do now is your choice." Tears sprang to Cassandra's eyes, and she quickly blinked them away. "Thank you," she whispered, unable to say more past the lump in her throat. They finished their coffee in comfortable silence before continuing their journey. The terrain grew rougher as they climbed, the trail narrowing as it wound through stands of pine and aspen. Just as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they crested a ridge, and Cassandra caught her first glimpse of Blake's ranch in the valley below. It was indeed modest, just as he described: a sturdy log cabin with a stone chimney, a small barn and corrals where cattle grazed in fenced meadows. A creek wound through the property, its banks lined with cottonwoods. Smoke curled from the chimney, which confused Cassandra. "Is someone there?" she asked. "Probably just Pedro," Blake explained. "He helps around the ranch, comes up from the Mexican settlement a few miles south every few days. Good man." As they rode down into the valley, Cassandra felt a strange mixture of trepidation and hope. This peaceful homestead represented sanctuary, but it was still unknown territory with a man she'd just met. A figure emerged from the cabin as they approached a middle-aged Mexican man who raised a hand in greeting. He hurried to help them dismount, his dark eyes curious but kind as they fell on Cassandra and the baby. "Pedro, this is Mrs. Shaw and her daughter, Emily," Blake said. "They'll be staying with us for a time." Pedro nodded respectfully. "Bienvenidas, señoras," he said with a warm smile. "I have stew cooking." Pedro's wife taught him to cook, Blake explained as he led them toward the cabin. "Better than anything I could manage." The cabin's interior was simple but clean. A main room served as kitchen and living area, with a solid table, several chairs, a cast iron stove, and a stone fireplace where a fire crackled welcomingly. Through a doorway, Cassandra glimpsed the second room with its bed and chest of drawers. "You and Emily will take my room," Blake said, following her gaze. "I'll sleep out here." "I couldn't possibly," Cassandra began to protest. "You can and you will," Blake insisted gently. "You both need proper rest after what you've been through." Pedro served the promised stew, a rich mixture of beef, beans, and vegetables along with fresh baked cornbread. It was the best meal Cassandra had eaten in months, and she found herself ravenous. Blake and Pedro talked quietly about ranch matters while she ate, giving her space to simply enjoy the food and the feeling of safety. After supper, Pedro departed for his own home, promising to return in 2 days. Blake showed Cassandra where he kept clean linens, offered her one of his shirts to sleep in, and gathered what he needed for the night before giving her and Emily privacy in the bedroom. The bed was a simple frame with a straw tick mattress, but it felt luxurious after months of making do in increasingly desperate circumstances. Cassandra changed Emily's cloth diaper, using the clean rags Blake had provided, and nursed her until she fell asleep. Then she carefully placed the baby in the middle of the bed, building a barrier of blankets around her to prevent her from rolling off. Before climbing in beside her daughter, Cassandra stood by the small window, gazing out at the stars that seemed impossibly bright in the clear mountain sky. In the main room, she could hear Blake moving about, banking the fire for the night. For the first time since Thomas's death, she allowed herself to feel something beyond grief and fear. It wasn't happiness exactly, her wounds were too fresh for that, but perhaps it was the beginning of hope. Morning came with the crowing of a rooster and the distant lowing of cattle. Cassandra woke disoriented before remembering where she was. Emily still slept peacefully beside her, tiny fists curled above her head. Through the window, golden light spilled across the valley, and Cassandra could see Blake already at work in the corral, leading a horse through some kind of training exercise. She washed and dressed quickly in the same clothes from yesterday, the only ones she had, and ventured into the main room with Emily in her arms. Coffee bubbled on the stove, and a note on the table informed her there was fresh milk in the springhouse behind the cabin if she wanted it. The cool morning air felt refreshing as she stepped outside. The springhouse was built over a natural spring that kept milk, butter, and other perishables cool. Inside, Cassandra found a ceramic jug of milk along with eggs and a side of bacon. She gathered what she needed for breakfast and returned to the cabin. By the time Blake came in from the corral, she had eggs and bacon cooking and had managed to make a passable batch of biscuits in the unfamiliar stove. He paused in the doorway, surprise evident on his face. "You didn't have to cook." "I wanted to," Cassandra replied. "It's the least I can do." Blake washed his hands and face in the basin by the door, then sat at the table. "Sleep well. Better than I have in months," she admitted, placing a plate before him. "Thank you again for your kindness." They ate in companionable silence until Emily began to fuss. Cassandra started to rise, but Blake waved her back to her seat. "Finish your breakfast," he said, standing to lift the baby from the makeshift cradle he'd fashioned from a wooden crate lined with blankets. "I've got her." Cassandra watched in amazement as Blake competently held Emily, bouncing her gently as he paced the room. His large, calloused hands looked incongruous against the infant's tiny form, yet he handled her with surprising gentleness. "You're good with her," Cassandra observed. A shadow passed over Blake's face. "Had some practice with my nephew before." He didn't finish the sentence, but Cassandra understood. After breakfast, Blake announced he needed to ride out to check the herd. "I'll be back by midday. Make yourself at home. There's a washtub behind the screen if you want to bathe, and plenty of hot water on the stove." Once he'd gone, Cassandra took advantage of the opportunity to give both herself and Emily a proper bath. The warm water soothed her aching muscles, and for the first time in days, she felt truly clean. She washed their clothes as well, hanging them to dry in the spring sunshine. Dressed in Blake's borrowed shirt, which fell to her knees, she explored the cabin more thoroughly. A bookshelf held a surprising collection: novels by Dickens and Hawthorne, poetry by Whitman, practical guides to ranching and farming, and a Bible that showed signs of regular use. A desk in the corner contained paper, pens, and a ledger where Blake apparently kept the ranch accounts. On a high shelf, out of casual view, stood a framed daguerreotype of a young woman holding an infant. Cassandra didn't need to ask to know this was Blake's sister and nephew. She carefully returned it to its place, feeling as though she'd intruded on something private. Outside, the day was warming beautifully. With Emily contentedly sleeping in her crate cradle, Cassandra carried it outside and set it in the shade of the cabin's porch while she examined the garden plot Blake had mentioned. It had been planted at some point but was now overgrown with weeds. Still, she could make out rows of what might be potatoes and other hardy vegetables struggling beneath the invaders. Cassandra found a hoe leaning against the barn and set to work clearing a section, finding unexpected satisfaction in the physical labor. She was so absorbed in the task that she didn't hear Blake's return until he spoke from behind her. "You don't waste time," he commented, dismounting from his horse. Cassandra straightened, pushing a strand of hair from her face, suddenly aware of her appearance barefoot in his borrowed shirt, her hair falling from its pins, her hands dirty from gardening. "I hope you don't mind," she said, gesturing to the partially cleared plot. "Not at all." He tied his horse to the hitching post. "Though I didn't expect you to start working so soon." "Idle hands are the devil's workshop," she quipped, then grew serious. "Honestly, it helps to stay busy, keeps me from thinking too much." Blake nodded in understanding. "I found the same after the war. And after losing Sarah and little James." He glanced at the daguerreotype visible through the cabin window. "Work doesn't heal the wounds, but it makes them bearable." Over the next few days, they settled into an uneasy routine. Blake worked with his cattle and horses, while Cassandra tended to Emily, cooked meals, and continued rehabilitating the garden. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes reading in comfortable silence. Cassandra learned that Blake had grown up on a farm in Illinois, the son of Irish immigrants. He'd fought with the Union cavalry during the war, surviving battles that had claimed many of his friends. Afterward, finding his sister and nephew dead and his parents having passed during his absence, he'd headed west seeking a fresh start. "Colorado seemed as good a place as any," he explained one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. "Plenty of land for those willing to work it." "You've done well for yourself," Cassandra observed, gesturing to the neat ranch spread out before them. Blake shrugged. "It's a start. Another year or two and I'll have enough cattle to make a proper profit." He glanced at her. "What about you? What did you imagine for yourself before life took its turns?" Cassandra sighed, adjusting Emily in her arms. "I wanted to keep teaching. Thomas and I talked about starting a school once we were established here. He believed the West needed education as much as it needed commerce." She looked down at her daughter. "Now, I just want Emily to have a safe place to grow up, somewhere she can learn and thrive." "Black Hawk has a schoolhouse," Blake said. "Not much of one yet, but the town's growing fast with the mining boom. Are you suggesting I could teach there?" Cassandra asked, surprised. "Why not? Once things settle and you decide what you want to do." His blue eyes held hers. "Unless you're planning to return east," Cassandra shook her head slowly. "There's nothing for me there anymore. My parents are gone, and the few relatives I have weren't exactly supportive of my marriage to Thomas." She hesitated. "But I don't want to impose on your hospitality indefinitely." "You're not imposing," Blake said firmly. "Having you and Emily here." He paused, seeming to search for words. "It's made this place feel more like a home and less like just a place to sleep between workdays." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within Cassandra. For a moment, they sat in silence, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. The moment was broken by Emily's sudden cry. Cassandra rose to take her inside for feeding, and Blake remained on the porch, his eyes following her until she disappeared into the cabin. As April turned to May, the mountain spring blossomed around them. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows, and the garden Cassandra had reclaimed began producing tender greens. Pedro brought his wife, Luisa, to meet Cassandra, and the two women formed an immediate bond despite the language barrier. Luisa brought gifts: a handmade dress for Emily, fabric and patterns for Cassandra, and seeds for the garden. Through Luisa's husband's translation, Cassandra learned that the Mexican woman had lost 2 children to fever years earlier. The way she gazed at Emily spoke volumes about her lingering grief. Before leaving, Luisa embraced Cassandra tightly and said something that made Pedro smile. "She says you bring light back to Senor Blake's eyes," he translated. "She is worried for him being alone too much." Cassandra felt heat rise in her cheeks and didn't know how to respond. She had noticed Blake watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, and she couldn't deny that her own gaze often sought him out as he worked around the ranch. There was something compelling about his quiet strength and the gentle way he interacted with Emily, who seemed fascinated by his deep voice and had taken to smiling whenever he spoke. One afternoon, Blake returned from town with supplies and a surprise fabric for new clothes for Cassandra and Emily, along with a ready-made dress that would serve until she could sew others. "The general store had it," he explained awkwardly when she expressed her gratitude. "Ordered for someone who never claimed it. Shopkeeper was happy to sell it at a discount." The dress was a simple calico in a blue that complemented Cassandra's eyes, and though it needed slight alterations, it fit well enough. She changed into it immediately, feeling more like herself than she had in weeks. When she emerged from the bedroom, Blake's expression made her heart flutter. He quickly looked away, busying himself with unpacking the rest of the supplies, but not before she caught the admiration in his eyes. That evening, as Cassandra sat mending one of Blake's shirts by the fire, she found the courage to broach a subject that had been on her mind. "Blake," she began tentatively, "I've been thinking about my situation." He looked up from the ledger where he'd been recording the day's work. "Go on." "I can't stay here indefinitely without contributing more substantially," she said. "You've already done so much, but I need to support myself and Emily." Blake closed the ledger. "You cook, clean, garden, you're contributing plenty." "That's not what I mean," Cassandra replied. "I need to earn my own way. You mentioned the school in Black Hawk. Do you think they might need a teacher?" Blake considered this. "They might. Town's growing fast with the gold mines bringing in new families every month." He hesitated. "But Black Hawk's a rough place, Cassandra. And Hollister's still there." The mention of her late husband's business partner sent a chill through her. "I hadn't thought of that," she admitted. "I'm not saying you shouldn't teach," Blake clarified. "Just that Black Hawk might not be the best place." "Are there other options?" she asked. Blake rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "Central City's not far, bigger than Black Hawk, more established. They probably need teachers too." He paused. Or, she prompted when he didn't continue. "You could teach here," he suggested. "Not just Emily, but other children from nearby ranches and the Mexican settlement. There are at least a dozen school-age children within riding distance who get little or no education." Cassandra's eyes widened at the unexpected proposal. "You mean start a school here, at the ranch?" "We could convert part of the barn," Blake said, warming to the idea. "It wouldn't be fancy, but it would serve until something better could be built. Families could pay what they can: eggs, milk, labor, whatever they can spare." The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. "Do you really think it could work?" "I do," Blake said with conviction. "These families want education for their children, but the nearest proper school is too far for daily travel. You'd be filling a real need." Cassandra's mind raced with possibilities. "We'd need books, slates, chalk." "I'll ride to Denver next week," Blake offered. We can make a list of what you need." For the first time since Thomas's death, Cassandra felt a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. "Thank you," she said softly, "for believing in me." Blake's expression grew serious. "Cassandra, there's something else we need to discuss." He set aside his ledger and moved to sit closer to her. "I've been thinking about your legal situation." Her hand stilled on her mending. "What about it?" "Hollister has no legal claim on you, but that might not stop him from trying to assert one if he discovers where you are," Blake explained. "As a widow without means, your position is vulnerable." "What are you suggesting?" Cassandra asked, a nervous flutter in her stomach. Blake met her gaze directly. "A marriage of convenience would offer you legal protection. As my wife, you'd have rights to the ranch, and Hollister couldn't touch you or Emily." The proposal hung in the air between them, unexpected and fraught with implications. "I'm not asking for anything more than you're willing to give," Blake continued when she didn't respond. "We'd continue as we have been. You'd have your own room, your own life. I just want to ensure you and Emily are safe." Cassandra's thoughts whirled. A marriage of convenience. The concept wasn't unfamiliar. Such arrangements were common in the West, where women were scarce, and the practicalities of frontier life often outweighed romantic considerations. But this was different. This was Blake. "I need time to think about it," she finally said. "Of course," he replied, looking relieved that she hadn't outright rejected the idea. "There's no rush, just consider it." That night, Cassandra lay awake long after Emily had fallen asleep, weighing Blake's proposal. The practical benefits were clear: legal protection, security for Emily, a stable home. But what about her heart? She'd loved Thomas deeply, had imagined growing old with him. Was she ready to enter another marriage, even one that existed only on paper? And yet, there was Blake. Kind, honorable Blake, who had rescued them without expectation of reward. Blake, whose gentle hands could calm a spooked horse or cradle an infant with equal care. Blake, whose rare smiles made something warm unfurl in her chest. Cassandra turned to look at Emily's sleeping form in the moonlight that filtered through the window. What future could she promise her daughter on her own? The life of a struggling widow and single mother would be hard, even if she managed to establish herself as a teacher. By morning, she had made her decision. She found Blake at the corral working with a young colt. He looked up as she approached, his expression questioning. "Yes," she said simply. Blake let the colt go and stepped out of the corral, coming to stand before her. "You're sure?" Cassandra nodded. "For Emily's sake and for the practical reasons you mentioned, it makes sense." She took a deep breath. "But I want to be clear about something." "Go on," he encouraged, his blue eyes intent on her face. "If we do this, if we marry, I want it to be a true partnership," she said firmly. "Not just a legal arrangement, but a sharing of work, of responsibility, of this life you've built." A smile slowly spread across Blake's face, transforming his features. "I wouldn't have it any other way." They were married 3 days later by a circuit-riding preacher who happened to be passing through the area. The ceremony was simple, held on the porch of the cabin with only Pedro, Louisa, and the Wilson family as witnesses. Cassandra wore the blue calico dress, with wildflowers from the meadow forming her bouquet, and a crown for Emily. As they exchanged vows, Cassandra was struck by the solemnity in Blake's eyes as he promised to honor and protect her. Though the marriage had been proposed as a practical solution, there was nothing perfunctory about the way he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, a ring that had belonged to his mother. He'd explained earlier. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the preacher declared. "You may kiss your bride." Blake hesitated, his eyes questioning. Cassandra gave a slight nod, and he leaned down to press his lips gently against hers. The kiss was brief, but stirred something deep within her, a flicker of possibility, of a future that might hold more than she dared hope for. After a celebratory meal prepared by Louisa, the guests departed, leaving the newly formed family alone. An awkward silence fell between them as they stood in the main room of the cabin, now officially their shared home. "I should check on the cattle before dark," Blake finally said, reaching for his hat. "Of course," Cassandra replied, grateful for the moment to collect her thoughts. When Blake returned an hour later, he found Cassandra sitting by the fire, Emily asleep in her cradle nearby. She had changed into a nightgown and robe, her hair loose around her shoulders. "I've made up a bed for you here," she said, gesturing to the pallet she'd arranged on the floor near the fireplace. Blake nodded, accepting without question that she wasn't ready to share the bedroom. "Thank you." "Blake," she began hesitantly, "I want you to know that I'm grateful for what you've done, not just today, but from the moment you found us at that auction." He sat beside her on the bench. "You don't need to thank me, Cassandra, you and Emily. You've brought something back to this place to me that I thought was gone for good." "What's that?" she asked softly. "Hope," he said simply. Then, with a gentle squeeze of her hand, he rose and moved to his pallet, giving her the privacy to retire to the bedroom. As spring yielded to summer, the unlikely marriage settled into a rhythm. Blake continued his work with the cattle and horses, while Cassandra tended the garden, which now flourished under her care. Together, they converted a section of the barn into a schoolroom, complete with crude desks fashioned by Blake and a slate board mounted on the wall. Word spread about the ranch school, and by mid-June, 8 children arrived for lessons 3 days a week, 5 from nearby ranches and 3 from the Mexican settlement. Cassandra taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and history, finding joy in the eager young minds. The families paid what they could: fresh eggs, vegetables, handcrafted items, and occasionally a few coins. Blake watched her work with pride, often stopping by the barn-turned-schoolhouse to listen as she read aloud or explained a particularly difficult concept. The children adored her, and she blossomed in her role as teacher, the shadow of grief that had haunted her eyes gradually fading. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch, watching the sunset while Emily played on a blanket at their feet. The baby was growing quickly, now able to sit up on her own and babbling constantly. Blake delighted in her development, his face lighting up whenever she reached for him with chubby hands. One such evening in late July, as they watched stars appear in the deepening twilight, Blake turned to Cassandra with an uncharacteristically nervous expression. "There's a social in Central City this Saturday," he said. "Dance, picnic, that sort of thing. I thought maybe, if you'd like, we could go." Cassandra looked up in surprise. They had made occasional trips to town for supplies but hadn't attended any social functions together. "As a family, you mean?" "Yes," Blake nodded. "It might be nice for you to meet more people from the area and to have some enjoyment beyond work and lessons." The thoughtfulness of the suggestion touched her. "I'd like that very much," she said with a smile. Saturday dawned clear and warm. Cassandra wore her best dress, a sage green cotton that she had sewn herself from fabric Blake had brought from Denver. She arranged her hair carefully and even pinned a wildflower behind one ear. Emily was dressed in a white pinafore over a pale yellow dress, looking angelic with her wispy blonde curls. When Cassandra emerged from the bedroom with Emily in her arms, Blake's expression made her blush. He was dressed in clean black pants, a white shirt, and a vest, his dark hair slicked back from his forehead. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "As do you," she replied, meaning it. Blake O'Connor cleaned up remarkably well, the rough-hewn rancher transformed into a handsome gentleman. They traveled to Central City in Blake's wagon, Emily securely nestled between them. The mining town was bustling with activity, its main street lined with substantial buildings that spoke of the prosperity gold and silver had brought to the area. The social was held in a meadow on the outskirts of town, where tables had been set up for the potluck dinner and a wooden platform constructed for dancing. Fiddle music filled the air, and children darted between groups of chatting adults. Cassandra felt a momentary trepidation as they approached. These people were strangers, and she hadn't socialized much since Thomas's death. But Blake's steady presence beside her bolstered her confidence. They were welcomed warmly, particularly after Blake introduced Cassandra as the school teacher who had established classes for the outlying ranches. Several mothers expressed interest in sending their children, and Cassandra found herself engaged in animated conversation about education while Blake held Emily. After the communal dinner, the dancing began in earnest. Blake handed Emily to Mrs. Wilson, who had offered to watch the baby, and turned to Cassandra with an outstretched hand. "May I have this dance, Mrs. O'Connor?" he asked formally. The use of his surname, now legally hers as well, sent an unexpected thrill through Cassandra. "You may," she replied, placing her hand in his. Blake led her to the dance floor where other couples were already moving to the lively tune. His hand at her waist was warm and sure as he guided her through the steps. Cassandra had danced at socials in Boston, but never like this, never with a partner whose touch seemed to burn through the fabric of her dress, whose blue eyes held hers with such intensity. They danced through several songs, from energetic reels to slower waltzes. During one such waltz, Blake drew her closer than was strictly proper, his cheek nearly touching her hair. "I never thanked you," he said softly. "For what?" she asked, breathless from more than just the dancing. "For staying, for making my house a home, for bringing music and laughter back into my life." The sincerity in his voice made her heart race. "I should be thanking you," she replied. "You gave us a chance when no one else would." "Cassandra," he began, his voice dropping lower, but whatever he intended to say was interrupted by a commotion at the edge of the dance floor. A group of rowdy miners had arrived, already drunk and looking for trouble. One of them had grabbed a young woman who was clearly trying to get away from him. Blake immediately released Cassandra. "Stay here," he said firmly, moving toward the disturbance. Several other men, including the town sheriff, converged on the scene. Words were exchanged, then shoves, and suddenly one of the miners threw a punch. The sheriff dodged, but another man wasn't so lucky. Within moments, a full-fledged brawl had erupted. Cassandra hurried to where Mrs. Wilson sat with Emily and several other small children, all watching the fight with wide eyes. She took Emily into her arms, holding her protectively as the chaos unfolded. Blake had positioned himself between the miners and the dance platform, helping to form a barrier that kept the fight away from the women and children. He wasn't actively involved in the brawl, but stood ready to intercede if necessary. The sheriff and his deputies eventually managed to subdue the troublemakers, hauling them off to the town jail amid curses and threats. Blake returned to Cassandra's side, his expression concerned. "Are you both all right?" he asked, his eyes scanning them for any sign of distress. "We're fine," Cassandra assured him. "You?" "Never better," he replied with a wry smile, though she noticed he was flexing his right hand as if it pained him. The dance resumed, but the mood had been dampened by the interruption. After another hour, Blake suggested they head home while Emily was still content. Cassandra agreed, feeling a mixture of disappointment that their outing had been cut short and relief to be returning to the peaceful sanctuary of their ranch. The wagon ride home was quiet, Emily sleeping soundly between them. As they crested the ridge that overlooked their valley, the full moon bathed the landscape in silver light, making the scene almost magical. Blake stopped the wagon at the top of the ridge, setting the brake before turning to Cassandra. "I'm sorry about what happened," he said. "I wanted the day to be perfect for you." "It was lovely," she assured him. "One little incident doesn't change that." "Still," he insisted, "you deserve better than a brawl at your first social outing." "Blake," Cassandra said gently, "I'm not some delicate flower that wilts at the first sign of trouble. I've endured far worse than witnessing a fight." He studied her face in the moonlight, his expression softening. "You are the strongest woman I've ever known," he said quietly. Before she could respond, he leaned across the sleeping baby and kissed her. Unlike the chaste peck at their wedding, this was a real kiss, tender yet insistent, his hand coming up to cradle her cheek. Cassandra found herself responding without hesitation, her lips parting beneath his, a warmth spreading through her body that had nothing to do with the summer night. When they finally separated, both were breathing quickly. "I've wanted to do that for weeks," Blake admitted, his voice husky. "Why didn't you?" she asked, her own voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to rush you, didn't want you to think I expected anything because of our arrangement." His thumb traced her jawline. "I know you loved your husband, Cassandra. I would never presume to replace him in your heart." "Thomas will always be a part of me," she acknowledged. "He gave me Emily, and for that I'll be forever grateful." She placed her hand over Blake's where it rested against her cheek. "But my heart isn't so small that it can't love again." The word love hung between them, neither quite ready to claim it directly yet both feeling its undeniable presence. Blake kissed her once more, briefly but with promise, before releasing the brake and guiding the wagon down toward home. That night, for the first time since their wedding, Blake didn't sleep on a pallet by the fire. Instead, after ensuring Emily was settled in her cradle, he joined Cassandra in the bedroom that had become truly theirs. Their lovemaking was tender and unhurried, a physical expression of the feelings that had been growing between them for months. Afterward, as Cassandra lay with her head on Blake's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, she felt a sense of completion she hadn't thought possible after losing Thomas. Different, but no less real. "I never thought I'd find this again," Blake murmured, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "Find what?" she asked, looking up at him. His blue eyes were serious in the dim light. "Home. Not just a place, but that feeling of belonging somewhere with someone." Cassandra pressed a kiss to his chest, directly over his heart. "I know exactly what you mean." As summer turned to autumn, their relationship deepened. What had begun as a marriage of convenience had transformed into a true union of hearts and minds. Blake no longer hesitated to show his affection, often pulling Cassandra into his arms for a kiss when he returned from working the range or reaching for her hand as they sat together in the evenings. The school continued to thrive, with 12 students now attending regularly. Word of Cassandra's teaching had spread, and several families had moved closer to the ranch specifically so their children could receive an education. Blake had begun drawing up plans for a proper schoolhouse to be built in the spring, using lumber from a stand of pines on their property. Emily celebrated her first birthday in October, marking a year since Thomas's death as well. Cassandra felt the grief anew on that day, but it was tempered by the joy of watching her daughter take her first unsteady steps across the cabin floor into Blake's waiting arms. Later that evening, after Emily had been put to bed, Blake presented Cassandra with a small wooden box. "I've been working on this for a while," he said, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Wanted it to be ready for Emily's birthday." Cassandra opened the box to find a delicately carved wooden locket on a leather cord. When she pressed the tiny clasp, it opened to reveal miniature portraits Thomas on one side, rendered from the small photograph Cassandra had managed to keep during her ordeal, and Blake on the other. "I thought when she's old enough to understand, she should know both her fathers," Blake explained. "The man who gave her life and the one who chose her." Tears welled in Cassandra's eyes. The thoughtfulness of the gift, the acknowledgement of Thomas's place in Emily's life, even as Blake had fully embraced the role of father, moved her deeply. "It's perfect," she whispered, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "You're perfect." Blake smiled against her lips. "Far from it. But I try to be worthy of you both." November brought the first snowfall, blanketing the valley in pristine white. School was suspended until spring, though Cassandra continued to teach the closest children when weather permitted. The cattle were moved to lower pastures, and Blake spent long days ensuring the ranch was prepared for the harsh mountain winter ahead. They celebrated Thanksgiving with the Wilsons, Pedro and Luisa, and several other neighboring families, filling the cabin with warmth and laughter. As Cassandra watched Blake carve the turkey, Emily perched happily on his knee. She felt overwhelming gratitude for the life they had built together. Later that night, after their guests had departed and Emily slept soundly in her new bed, a smaller version of their own that Blake had crafted, Cassandra sat before the fire, finishing a quilt she was making for the baby's Christmas gift. "You're quiet," Blake observed, pouring them each a cup of hot cider before joining her. "Just thinking," she replied, setting aside her sewing, "about how much has changed in a year. Last Thanksgiving I was newly widowed, terrified about the future, trying to keep Emily fed." She shook her head at the memory. "And now here we are." Blake took her hand, interlacing their fingers. "Are you happy, Cassandra?" "Truly," she met his gaze steadily. "Happier than I ever imagined possible after Thomas died." She squeezed his hand. "You've given us so much, Blake. Not just shelter and security, but love." "You've given me just as much," he replied. "More, even." He hesitated, then continued, "There's something I've been meaning to ask you." "What is it?" she prompted when he fell silent. Blake set down his cider and reached into his pocket, withdrawing a folded document. "This came from Denver last week," he explained, handing it to her. "I've had a lawyer draw up adoption papers for Emily. If you're willing, I'd like to legally become her father." Cassandra unfolded the document, reading the formal language that would make Blake Emily's legal parent while preserving her birth father's name. "You want to adopt her?" "Only if you approve," Blake said quickly. "I know she'll always be Thomas's daughter by blood. But in every way that matters day to day, I already think of her as mine." His expression grew vulnerable. "I love her, Cassandra, as much as if she were my own flesh and blood." Cassandra felt tears spring to her eyes for the second time that day. "Of course I approve," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Nothing would make me happier than for Emily to have you as her father in name as well as in heart." Blake's relief was palpable. "Thank you," he said simply, gathering her into his arms. As they sat entwined before the fire, Cassandra marveled at the journey that had brought them here. From the humiliation and terror of that auction block to this moment of profound contentment, it seemed almost miraculous. "I have news too," she said after a long, comfortable silence. Blake pulled back slightly to look at her. "What kind of news?" Cassandra took his hand and placed it on her stomach, still flat but harboring a precious secret. "Emily will be a big sister come summer," she said softly. Blake's expression transformed from confusion to wonder in an instant. "You're with child," he whispered, as if speaking too loudly might somehow dispel the magic of the moment. Cassandra nodded, her heart full to bursting at the joy spreading across his face. "About 2 months along, I think." Blake let out a whoop of delight, lifting her from the bench and spinning her in a circle before setting her gently back on her feet, suddenly concerned. "I didn't hurt you, did I? Or the baby?" she laughed, placing her hands on either side of his face. "We're fine. Perfectly fine." He kissed her then, pouring all his happiness into the connection between them. When they separated, his blue eyes were suspiciously bright. "I love you, Cassandra O'Connor," he said fervently, "more than I have words to express." "And I love you," she replied, the words simple but profound in their truth. December passed in a flurry of preparations not just for Christmas, but for the baby who would join their family in early summer. Blake was constantly bringing home surprises. A rocking chair he'd traded a yearling calf for, soft flannel for baby clothes, a carving of a horse for Emily that he'd worked on secretly during the long winter evenings. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, the sun turning the snow-covered landscape into a sea of diamonds. Emily, now toddling confidently, was enchanted by the small tree Blake had cut and decorated with paper stars and strung cranberries. Her delight in the simplest gifts the quilt Cassandra had made, a rag doll from Louisa, the wooden horse from Blake, was infectious. That evening, after Emily had been tucked into bed with her new treasures, Blake presented Cassandra with a final gift, a silver locket containing a lock of Emily's hair and a space left empty. "For the new baby," he explained as she admired it. "It's beautiful," she said, fastening it around her neck. "I have one more gift for you, too." She retrieved a package from its hiding place behind the bookshelf and handed it to Blake. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its cover tooled with an intricate design of mountains and pine trees. "Open it," she encouraged when he looked at her questioningly. Blake turned to the first page, where Cassandra had written in her neat schoolteacher's hand. "For James Blake O'Connor, Jr., the story of how your father saved a woman and child, and in doing so, found his own heart's home." The rest of the pages were blank, waiting to be filled with the story of their life together. Blake ran his fingers over the words, visibly moved. "James?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "After your nephew," Cassandra confirmed. "I thought if the baby is a boy." She didn't finish, seeing in his face that the gesture had touched him deeply. "And if it's a girl?" he asked, setting the journal aside carefully. Cassandra smiled. "I was thinking Sarah after your sister." She took his hand, placing it over her still flat stomach. "Either way, this child will know the story of how their father's courage and kindness changed everything for us." Blake drew her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "I still can't believe it sometimes," he murmured against her hair. "That day in Black Hawk when I saw you on that auction block. I was just riding through town, had no plans to stay, but something made me stop." "Fate," Cassandra suggested, "or angels," Blake replied. "Sarah always believed they watched over us." He pulled back to look into her eyes. "All I know is that the moment I saw you holding Emily, something inside me knew I had to protect you both." "And you have," Cassandra assured him. "More than protected, you've given us a home, a family, a future." "We've given those things to each other," Blake corrected gently. "That's what family does." As they settled before the fire, Blake's arm around her shoulders and Cassandra's head resting against his chest, she reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past year. From the depths of despair on that auction block to this moment of perfect contentment, it was a testament to the resilience of the human heart and its capacity for love. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting down from a star-filled sky. Inside, the fire crackled warmly, casting a golden glow over the cabin that had become a true home. In her bed, Emily slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge even at her young age that she was deeply loved. And within Cassandra's womb, a new life grew, the promise of their future together. "What are you thinking?" Blake asked, noticing her pensive expression. Cassandra smiled up at him, her heart full of gratitude and love. "That sometimes the darkest moments lead us to the brightest light. That day at the auction, I thought it was the end of everything. But it was really just the beginning." Blake pressed a kiss to her forehead, his arms tightening around her. "The beginning of our story," he agreed, "and we've got a lifetime left to write." 5 years later, the schoolhouse bell rang out across the valley, signaling the end of lessons for the day. Cassandra gathered her teaching materials as 20 children of various ages collected their slates and books, chattering excitedly about the upcoming Founders' Day celebration. "Remember your assignments," she called over the din, "and practice your recitations for the celebration." As the students filed out, Emily, now 6 years old with her mother's blonde curls and her adoptive father's blue eyes, helped the younger children with their coats and lunch pails. Her natural nurturing instinct had only grown stronger with the arrival of her siblings. James, 4 years old and the spitting image of Blake with his dark hair and serious expression, was already showing a gift for working with horses. And little Sarah, just 2, had inherited her namesake aunt's artistic talent, already creating recognizable drawings with her chubby fingers. "Mama, can I ride out with Papa to check the new foal?" Emily asked, returning to help Cassandra erase the chalkboard. "If you finish your chores first," Cassandra replied with a smile. Her oldest daughter's love for horses matched Blake's own, and he delighted in teaching her everything he knew. They walked together from the schoolhouse, a proper building now, with glass windows and a bell tower, toward the main house. The ranch had grown substantially over the years, as had the settlement around it. What had once been an isolated homestead was now the center of a thriving community named, appropriately enough, O'Connor's Crossing. Blake had used his savings to buy additional land when neighboring ranches went up for sale, expanding their cattle operation. Cassandra's school had drawn families to the area, and a small town had gradually formed, first a general store, then a blacksmith, a church, and most recently, a doctor's office. The original cabin had been expanded too, with Blake adding rooms as their family grew. Now it was a proper home with 4 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and a parlor where Cassandra gave piano lessons on the instrument Blake had surprised her with on their 3rd anniversary. As they approached the house, Cassandra saw Blake returning from the south pasture, James perched proudly in front of him on the saddle. The sight of them still made her heart skip a beat. Her handsome husband with his perpetual 3-day stubble, and their son who worshipped the ground he walked on. "Mama, I helped Papa with the fence," James called as Blake dismounted and lifted him down. "Did you now?" Cassandra replied, accepting a kiss from Blake before bending to hear James's excited recounting of their afternoon's work. While Emily took the horse to the barn to brush him down her favorite chore, Blake scooped up Sarah, who had toddled out onto the porch at the sound of their arrival. "And how's my little artist today?" he asked, tossing her into the air and catching her as she shrieked with delight. "Draw horsey," Sarah announced, pointing toward the barn. "After supper," Blake promised, settling her on his hip as they all went inside. The evening routine was comfortably chaotic: supper preparation, interspersed with homework supervision, stories about the day's events, and occasional refereeing of sibling disputes. Pedro's son Miguel, now 15 and Blake's right hand on the ranch, joined them as he often did, adding another place at their expanding table. After the meal, while Cassandra supervised the children's bath time, Blake sat on the porch with Miguel, discussing the next day's work. The young man had a natural gift with cattle, and was saving his wages to buy his own small herd someday, a dream Blake actively encouraged. Later, once the children were tucked into bed, Cassandra found Blake in their bedroom, standing by the window that overlooked the valley. The setting sun cast the landscape in hues of gold and crimson, highlighting how much had changed and grown in 5 years. She slipped her arms around his waist from behind, resting her cheek against his back. "Penny for your thoughts," she murmured. Blake turned in her embrace, gathering her close. "I was just thinking about that day in Black Hawk," he said, a familiar refrain that had become something of a private ritual between them. "About how differently things might have turned out if I hadn't ridden through town that particular day." "But you did," Cassandra reminded him, rising on tiptoe to press a kiss to the corner of his mouth. "You did, and here we are," he nodded, his expression growing more serious. "I got a letter from Denver today," he said. "From the lawyer." Cassandra stilled. They had been working with a lawyer for months, trying to bring charges against Gregory Hollister for his illegal indentured servitude auctions, which they had discovered were still happening in some of the more remote mining camps. "What did it say?" she asked. "They've arrested him," Blake replied, satisfaction evident in his voice. "Found enough evidence to charge him with multiple counts of fraudulent business practices and illegal servitude. He'll likely spend years in prison." Relief washed over Cassandra. Though Hollister had never discovered her whereabouts, the knowledge that he was still victimizing others had haunted her. "That's wonderful news," she said fervently. "There's more," Blake continued. "The lawyer says there may be reparations for his victims. Not much, but something." "I don't need money from him," Cassandra said firmly, "but I hope it helps the others." Blake smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I told him to distribute whatever would have come to you among the more recent victims, the ones who haven't had 5 years to rebuild their lives." "Thank you," she whispered, touched by his understanding. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, absorbing the news and its implications. Hollister's arrest represented the closing of a chapter in their lives, the final resolution of the trauma that had initially brought them together. "You know," Blake said thoughtfully, "in a strange way I almost feel like I should thank the man." Cassandra looked up in surprise. "Thank Hollister? Why on earth would you do that?" Blake's eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled down at her. "Because his despicable actions led me to you and Emily. Without that auction," he shrugged, "I might have ridden right through Black Hawk and never known what I was missing." "I prefer to thank whatever guardian angel placed you in that town square at precisely the right moment," Cassandra replied, sliding her hands up to link behind his neck. "Or perhaps it was Sarah, watching over you from above." "Perhaps," Blake agreed, his hands settling at her waist. "Whoever it was, I'm eternally grateful." As their lips met in a tender kiss, Cassandra reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the desperation and fear of that auction block to this life of abundance, not just material comfort, but the richness of family, community, and purpose. It was more than she could have imagined in those dark days after Thomas's death. "I love you, Blake O'Connor," she murmured against his lips. "More today than yesterday, and not as much as tomorrow." "And I love you," he replied, the words as heartfelt now as the first time he'd spoken them. "You and our children are everything to me." From the nursery came Sarah's sleepy call for a drink of water, prompting them both to smile. "Duty calls," Blake said, reluctantly releasing Cassandra. "Always does," she agreed with a laugh. "But I wouldn't change a thing." As Blake went to tend to their daughter, Cassandra moved to the bedroom window, gazing out at the land that had become their kingdom. In the distance, the lights of O'Connor's crossing twinkled like earthbound stars. Closer, the schoolhouse stood as a testament to their commitment to building not just a home but a community. 5 years ago, she had stood trembling on an auction block, a widow with an infant, facing a future that seemed impossibly bleak. Now she was a wife, mother, teacher, and cornerstone of a thriving settlement, all because one man had the courage to say, "I'll protect you both." Blake returned, Sarah drowsing against his shoulder. "Someone wanted to see her mama before going back to sleep," he explained, transferring the sleepy toddler to Cassandra's arms. As she held her youngest child, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair, Cassandra felt a profound sense of completion. This was what happiness felt like, not the absence of challenges or sorrows, but the presence of love strong enough to weather them. "Once upon a time," she whispered to Sarah, "there was a brave cowboy who rescued a mother and her baby." Blake's arm slipped around her waist as she began the familiar story, their story that had become a favorite bedtime tale for all their children. A true story of courage, kindness, and love that had the happiest of endings. Not an ending at all, Cassandra thought as she met Blake's loving gaze over their daughter's head, but a beginning that continued to unfold in beautiful, unexpected ways with each passing day. And in that moment, surrounded by the family they had built together, she knew with absolute certainty that some journeys, no matter how difficult their start, led exactly where you were meant to be all along.